since we're recording and Joe has stepped away, I feel I should say something about him, but I don't really know what to say because he's such a lovely guy and such a talented writer. Um, it's it's a little known fact that he is not originally Australian. He's actually from Ohio. The whole that's that up the British, that's just a myth. He just made that up because he was ashamed of being from Ohio. So yeah, the next time you see him, you can say you can call him Ohio Joe, or Joe Ohio, whichever you prefer. um I'm trying to think what else. He doesn't love Vegemite. He said he loves Vegemite. Doesn't love Vegemite. However, he has a thing for batter fried platypus beaks, which, I mean, what kind? Yeah, I know it's kind of monstrous, but even the best of us have our character defects, our character flaws. Um, yeah, I guess that's it. So we'll just sit here in uncomfortable silence while we wait for him to get back. Maybe I'll check my phone, see if there's anything from Australian INS. No, no. Yeah. Pum, 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 pum. Pum, 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 pum. Pum, 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 pum. I should probably be singing Australian music while I'm doing this, right? Uh, oh, he's back. He's back. All right. Be cool, everybody. Be cool. The audience and I did absolutely nothing while
I
you
was
were
going to
away.
say,
There was absolutely nothing record.
Who are you talking to, John?
No one at all. No one at all. There was nothing at all that I was saying.
I could hear it, and it was weird.
It got very weird. Yeah.
I mean, I couldn't hear what you were saying, but I could hear
that it was weird. You knew it was
talking.
Weird. You were just like, yeah.
I hope
Longstocking weird.
You weren't expecting answers. Like, there were some pauses.
Oh, I got my answers.
Okay.
No, I got my answers. I did.
Yeah. And so the audience
audience.
The audience is going to get more than they bargained for.
Exactly. The audience is in the future. Thank you, future audience, for your future answers.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. This is John Langan, and I'm very pleased today to be in conversation with the very talented J. Ashley Smith, who has a brand new collection, The Measure of Sorrow, being released by Meerkat Press. So we're going to talk about his book. We're going to talk about the inspirations behind his stories. But to start off with, he's going to give us the treat of reading us an excerpt from one of his stories. So I'll let Joe take it away.
Thank you, John. And before we go any further, please never call me Joe, or I will have to kill you.
Okay, Joey it is. Okay.
And right like that, just like that, it's off the rails.
J-Dog.
Look, I'm just not going to let you out of the cellar.
Damn it.
What do I cereal?
What do I have to do to get out of here? Can I get my Vegemite rations?
No, it's very simple. Just Joseph will do. Joseph will do. I probably should have said that before we were recording. But I
know. My God. Okay, well, go ahead.
That was a really lovely introduction, though. Thank you. And hello everyone. Thanks for joining us. And so I'm just going to do a quick reading a scene from the title novella, The Measure of Sorrow. And just to give a bit of context, it's not from the beginning, so just a bit of context. There's a guy called Chris and his son Callum, who have just been on a kind of beach holiday, like their first family holiday since Chris's wife, Callum's mother, died. And it sort of didn't turn out the way they wanted because it turned out to be a kind of remembering her everywhere kind of thing rather than a getting away and starting a new life together. So this comes in sort of like they're on their way home after this holiday that didn't go as planned, and they're just staying at a sort of farm stay in rural Australia, and they're staying in a little shearer's cottage on this farm, right next to a very big, weird and quite creepy barn. That night, Chris dreamt of Miriam for the first time since they saw her buried. She was paler than he remembered, and her hair was black and straight as a ribbon, but it was her just the same. He knew her by the ache in his chest, the sensation of falling, of descent without end. She ran ahead of him through the darkness, her nightdress billowing, through fields of tall grass wet from the rain, through a maze of black chambers inside the old barn. Then he lost her and was lost himself, wading through black waters in an underground tunnel, through the smell of mould and stone and decay, calling her name into the dripping echoes. And all around, from within the walls and behind and above, the grinding of colossal but invisible gears. Chris woke in wetness, his hand cold on soaked bedsheets. His first panicked thought was that Callum had a fever and had sweated the sheets through. Then he remembered the boy had fallen asleep fully clothed and hadn't put on his training pants. He and Miriam had been so proud when Callum decided, quite by himself, to give up nappies at bedtime. The boy had been 3 at the time, and they, younger, happier, oblivious of what lay ahead, saw in this decision more evidence of his inherent genius, another ray of glory from the wonder they'd created. The night of the funeral, Callum wet the bed for the first time in 2 years. He'd been unable to get to sleep on his own and had cried until Chris let him into bed. That morning, Chris had stripped the sheets, taken the mattress out onto the balcony to dry, performing the new tasks mechanically. Callum had been embarrassed, and his shame at this thing, so small in the light of everything else, was a weight that Chris carried still, that plummeted every time Chris saw in him all that was left in this world of her. Callum had slept in bed with him every night since the funeral, afraid perhaps that without this physical constant, he would wake one morning to find his father gone as well. Chris rolled out of the bed, leaving Callum spread across the wet mattress like a starfish. The curtains were thin, barely holding back the cold morning light. Chris squinted as he pulled them apart, then yelled, swore, heart tumbling at the sight of 2 large eyes just inches from his own. "What is it, Dad?" Callum sat up, rubbing his face. "Come and look," said Chris. Outside the window, calmly ruminating, holding his gaze with indifference, was a huge caramel alpaca. 2 more, dark brown, stooped behind it, bending to munch the grass around the cottage. He had forgotten to close the gate. It was an ordeal getting the alpacas out onto the driveway. They seemed quite content where they were, not a bit bothered by the man and boy at the window, entirely resistant to their claps, threats, and cajolements. Father and son dressed quickly, stripped the bed, spilled into the cottage's small garden to oust the stubborn invaders. At last, after much fruitless pushing, Chris remembered the food they'd been given the night before. He sent Callum out beyond the gate, shaking the bucket and calling to them while he drove from behind. At last, they got them through and closed the gate. Callum stood, laughing, completely surrounded, the alpacas peering down at him as he scooped handfuls of pellets from the bucket. Chris's attention was drawn again to the looming barn. In the daylight, it seemed even larger, even more out of place. It stood completely apart from the other farm buildings, twice or more the height of the woolshed, built of raw boards blackened with age. The barn seemed ancient, as though hewn from the landscape's earliest trees, a shelter for its first European settlers. But it was unlike anything Chris recognized from that era. In their long drives through rural towns and old farm country, they'd passed nothing to match it, nothing with even the vaguest resemblance. The whole structure was surrounded by a fence of orange and white construction tape, giving it the appearance of a creature penned. Echoes of the dream came back to him then, the distant whir of machinery and the grinding of hidden gears, and Miriam, at once close and impossibly far away, the darkness blooming and billowing and... "Dad?" Chris stopped, dazed. He had been walking away from Callum toward the barn. "Dad, I'm hungry." "Right, let's..." Took Chris a moment to get his bearings. Callum had emptied the bucket of feed onto the ground, and the alpacas were stooped around the pile. The boy stood beside them, holding the empty bucket. Chris rubbed his eyes, ran a hand down his face. Let's get cleaned up. Let's get cleaned up and go for brekkie. Callum gave him a strange look, one he found impossible to read. He gnawed at him as they closed the gate behind them and went back into the cottage to get ready. He gathered the bundled sheets, rinsed and wrung them, draped them, still dripping, over the fence. He pulled out the mattress and stood it on the deck, the familiar rhythms and routines transposed to this unfamiliar setting. Once they were washed and dressed, he and Callum followed the driveway up to the farm. As they passed the barn, Chris felt his head turning to keep it in sight. It really was exquisitely unusual. He longed to ignore the construction tape, push wide the rotting doors, and cloak himself in the darkness and decrepitude that lay beyond. Callum pulled at his hand, urging him forward. The boy kicked at the gravel as they walked, head down. I hate this place, he said. When are we going home?
Very nice. Very,
Thank
very
you.
nice. We can imagine everybody applauding out in
Yeah.
the digital world. Um,
I
so
I can put some canned applause on.
yes, nice, absolutely, absolutely. I guess my first question has to do with the collection itself. I wanted to ask if you could just talk about it in general terms. I as an early reader of it, I had the sense, or I was struck by the way the title of the collection reflects and refracts through the different stories in the collection, and at the risk of putting the cart before the horse a little bit, I thought to myself, wow, we think of the measure of sorrow, we think of the way, the amount of sorrow, right?
Yep.
But I thought, there's some weird way in which you could understand that as the way that sorrow measures us. So anyway, I just thought let's throw that out there for a second. We can talk. I do want to ask some more general questions about your life and the various, your bank account numbers, that sort of stuff. But
I'll share all that in the comments later.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, yeah, good. Keep an eye out, everybody.
Yeah.
Stay till the end. So yeah, could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, John. Like, interestingly, well, I don't know, maybe it's not interesting. We'll see. The title was something that I always had, if you know what I mean. Before I knew I had a collection, I knew I had a title for it. And like, I know a lot of authors kind of, when you're pulling together a collection, or even when, planning a collection in advance, depending on how you work, really think about it in terms of a theme, like having a sort of strong theme that runs through. And like, the theme was there for me, but it was very feeling based rather than thinking based, if that makes sense. It was really like a kind of feeling tone that I was exploring in stories that I knew, I had already, and stories that were kind of yet to be a part of the collection. So it was really something that I felt my way into rather than really cerebrally working out. The collection didn't really come together for me until the title story came together. Like, I had the title and I knew I had to write a story called that, and there were a bunch of first options for that, like none of which really worked. And I was sort of getting to this quite desperate point of like, like sort of Lebowski's rug, like, I can't tie the room together without this,
right.
without this story. And what became the title novella was originally, it was something that I started rather years ago, like probably almost 10 years ago, and I had kind of, written my way into a corner with, and I just couldn't get it to make sense or work. Like, I loved it. Like, I loved the characters. I loved what happened. But, it's just one of those stories. It's like, I guess I'm never going to finish this because it can't work. And it wasn't until sort of like spiraling through all of these kind of ideas and holding them up against this title. And this was the first one that kind of went, there's something there. And then going back and rewriting it kind of in the context of that idea, I guess, or theme, made it pop, made it kind of really work at last. So it was a trunker that kind of came back, and now it's like one of the things that I'm happiest with in the collection. Does that come close to answering the question?
Yeah, I think so. It's fascinating because I've had the similar experiences where you work on something and then you reach a point where you just think, I don't know, the car ran out of gas, or I'm stuck at a crossroads or something. And I guess the takeaway is don't throw anything away. Just put it away, and because a lot of times years may pass, you come back to it, and suddenly you're like, oh, this is obvious. I know what to do. And whether it's, maybe your brain's been working on it all along on some level, and now it's like, oh, okay, let's pass that up to the top.
Yeah. So just folding it back to you for a sec, like I kind of have been reading a couple of your collections recently.
So sorry.
Partly in I'll never forgive you. But there's a story in there I think it's in Corpse Mouth, but it might be I think it's in Corpse Mouth, about the tape. The band recording on the tape, and in your story notes you say that was something that you had a similar experience with in terms of.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. There were
only so far, and then missing an ingredient that could make it land.
Yeah, I think I had the voice and I knew sort of where it was going, but I didn't. It only got about halfway done, and then I was like, what do I do with this? And then after I wrote my second novel, the Fisherman, I realized, oh wait, this fits in there, or this fits into that world in some way, and yeah, that was the key. I had to write something else, to figure out the ending to this, and that's I sometimes think as writers, like because of the kind of world we live in, everything feels as if it has to be so urgent and it has to be done. It has to be, and Ellen Datlow somewhere is shrieking at me as I'm saying this.
It does, John. It does. And this is the date it has to be done by.
Don't convince other people of your nonsense. But you know what I mean? That maybe time as a kind of ingredient in writing is something. Look, even Dickens was up against deadlines, right? And I'm sure Shakespeare was too. It's like, come on, the place. But for all that, I think when we can, those moments when we can take time or allow ourselves to have time, you put this story aside, maybe you write something else for, whatever the prompt, whatever the anthology is. Maybe that's not such a bad thing,
And it's time, and it's actually like with your example with, like you had to write you had a literal whole novel and a world kind of within that novel to create before that story would make sense to you. It's time that allows sort of further exploration in other directions, and that's certainly the case with this story, The Measure of Sorrow. Until I had kind of branched out and done other things, and then was looking for some completely other thing, that there was no way I could solve the problem from within the world of the story as it existed that far.
Right.
The answer lay somewhere buried still, and there was digging elsewhere that needed to be done to unlock it.
It's an unanswerable question, but do you think, and I'm going to ask you,
I'll do my best.
Well, I wonder sometimes, do these things, are they forerunners in some way of the other work that you're going to do? In other words, you started to write this story, you reached a point where you're like, oh, I don't know, but was it that you took the you use the buried trope? Was it that you had uncovered something that was ultimately you were going to find your way to, or
Mm.
was it more of a kind of almost like a chemical reaction or something, where it's like, wait, I just discovered this thing and now it sparks with this thing I did before.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know if I'm articulating that quite as well as I would like, but
Yeah, I do know what you mean though. And this is something that we talk about, like it comes up again and again in Let the Cat In. Um, about, and we had a conversation about this just a couple of months ago, about actually kind of having to let things die. You like sort of having to let go of something in order to move on to the place where you can kind of find the thing that makes it make sense again. But you can't ever think, I'm going to make sense of this at some point. Do you know what I mean? Because otherwise it's still there,
yes,
nagging
yes,
at you. And you have to have that is it Archimedes eureka thing. You have to let
yeah,
go
yeah,
of the idea in order for it to kind of come back. And it's like I mean I have I come back to the sort of very obvious trope of the, thinking of the kind of our unconscious as essentially like a kind of black lake. And in in darkness, or you kind of go down into the bottom of your cellar and there's this kind of endless there's this endless black lake. um Sorry, I'm
no,
distracted
no,
by
i
the
i
ghosts in my house. Um,
I
and
don't know what you're
and
talking
like
about. I don't see anything,
when you
but
have a dream, for instance, and you remember some of it in the morning, but then you go to try and remember it, and it slips like through your fingers. It's like a fish
Mhm.
just sort of slipping back into that
Right,
water, and it kind of,
right,
and so I'm going deep into the metaphor here, but with those ideas, you kind of pull a thing out and you do your craft bit to it to try to realize that idea as much as you can in the world. But sometimes they're still not finished. They're still not, there's still more kind of soaking in that black water that needs to happen before it can be ready.
right.
And
It's
you
not
have
big
to,
enough to be caught.
exactly,
It
exactly.
hasn't reached the whatever the proper limit is,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
sizes
Yeah.
to,
Yeah. So with the fishing metaphor, yeah.
right, right,
It's
right,
not matured enough. And it needs more time back in that, and it's like it's nourished by that kind of darkness and depth, and you have to let it go and sort of swim away out of your
right.
control and kind of grow in its own weird world that you're not a part of. And then at some point, some other weird stuff that you're kind of nourishing that water with just by living, and some other thing connects with it and it kind of brings it back up to the surface.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's all sorts of stories. I mean, there's Michael Chabon's novel Wonder Boys, which was made into a reasonably entertaining film.
Yeah, I
And
love it.
there's the moment where the Michael Douglas character just loses his novel, this big novel that he's
Yeah.
just been working on forever, and apparently there's some autobiography in this, and it just blows away. And
Oh,
I think, and ultimately that is a redemptive or an
yeah.
important thing for the character, but I sort of feel like every writer in the audience is like, no, you didn't tell me this was a horror movie.
Yeah,
But
yeah, and it's sort of
you were,
necessary.
yeah.
There was another movie made kind of more recently, that has a similar thing, and I'm trying to remember what it is. I can't remember what it's called, but it's about a guy who goes to be the sort of amanuensis of a kind of absolutely dreadful Hemingway type writer character, and they work on a book together. That then the Hemingway type character, I think he kind of just like takes all the credit for it,
Mhm.
and the other guy's sort of bereft. But again, it's that redemptive thing of, this thing that you thought would be the important thing, the thing that makes you actually kind of need to let go of it, to not do that, and to
Well,
do the thing that's really genuine.
yeah, and there's geez, there's so many writers. I mean, there's the Hemingway's famous literal trunk story that he had a trunk full of manuscripts and whatever that was stolen at the train
Oh
station,
man,
and it was all just, well, I was just saying
yeah,
that for Hemingway, when we hear that story about him having lost his manuscripts, you think, oh my God, and it's the thing that must have seemed horrifying to him at first, but then also maybe felt liberating.
yeah, yeah,
All of that, he could start over, or start afresh.
yeah.
There's some story about Saul Bellow too, working on a big novel in the 60s maybe, that just never came to anything.
Mm.
And I'm not enough of a Bellow scholar to really know all the ins and outs of that, but it seems to me that you do hear about that happen. Stephen King has the story about starting the novel, I think it was going to be called The Cannibals, about a bunch of people trapped in an apartment building who start eating each other. And he abandoned that, but it ultimately became Under the Dome. It was the story
Ah,
that
right.
morphed into that.
See, I've got a personal uh personal version of this, in that before I moved to Australia, so I've lived here like 17 years. I moved here in 2006, and before, in the sort of 2 years before I came over, we moved over, I had written the first draft of a novel, and the plan was, we moved over and basically went and lived in the middle of the bush in a train carriage in the middle of the bush with pit toilet, no electricity, and I bought an old kind of typewriter from the sort of local
Yeah,
op
yeah,
shop
yeah.
and was like, okay, this is it, I'm gonna revise this novel, and in my head I was, Fitzgerald on the Riviera writing the Gatsby, like, because of course I can write
Right,
about home so well when I'm over here, and I
right,
just
right, right.
couldn't, I could not write it at all. Like, I couldn't make it happen, and it was, I know now it was because moving to the other side of the planet actually has a kind of psychological toll that you have to pay to move through. I had a life to build here. But that novel, and the fact of not being able, I knew I couldn't pick it up again. Like, it was a thing of its time.
Yeah,
But it was just like this huge block of concrete that just sat between me and the Black Lake,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
um,
yeah.
like a plug over someone had kind of boarded up the cellar and kind of filled filled the basement with concrete.
Right,
And
right.
and the only way that I could get past that, I actually ended up burning that book.
Hmm.
um, I still had, it's a symbolic gesture because I've still got all the files on it.
I was going to say it's backed up on the cloud
Yeah,
somewhere.
yeah.
Yeah.
but I had this big kind of block of paper, which was the kind of my edited printout of it, and we got a slow combustion, so we lived in the Blue Mountains at that time. Slow combustion stove, chucked it in, and man, it's fucking hard to burn a book. Turns out, like, paper doesn't burn easy when it's got no oxygen between its leaves, and
Yeah, yeah.
it took hours to burn
Well,
this
it
thing.
provided you heat for a long time.
Well,
It
and well,
was,
it burnt my hands and everything, but it, that symbolic gesture of kind of totally releasing it, like letting go of it, was actually kind of necessary to be able to go, okay, what next? Like, you sort of free the pathway down to that nourishing water.
yeah, no, I think sometimes, and I feel like you guys talk about this on the cat.
Mm.
But sometimes those kinds of symbolic gestures are actually can be very important to your
Yeah.
creative process. I mean, it's not necessarily to become as bad as an athlete who can only play if they're wearing certain socks or
Yeah.
whatever, but it is to say that allowing yourself, as you did, a kind of physical representation, a manifestation of what
Mm.
what you needed to do. Of course, you still have you
Yeah.
have copies of it, on the But and any publishers who are looking for that book, it's still available. Okay, after you read The Measure of Sorrow and you think, but what else is there? I'll
Yeah.
tell you what there is. There's a great big book that was difficult to burn. And that's the
Yeah.
new title of that novel, too, Difficult to Burn. We were going to go with Hard to Kill, but that's been done already. It was
Yeah,
a
yeah,
Steven Seagal
yeah.
movie. So Difficult to Burn, coming soon to a bookstore near you.
That's Wicker Man 2, isn't it? Like
You can't get the matches going. The
sort
guy's
of
in there. He's like,
that
let
sort of
me out.
yeah, rainy kind of Welsh countryside.
Maybe we'll just leave him up there for a while and let the rabbits get him. So not to get too lost in the novel, but was the novel also a work of weird fiction?
No.
Or, and I don't know, how do you so what is your relationship like? I know you solely as a writer of, the weird, the strange, the
Yeah.
horrific. Are you comfortable with that? Has that been something that's always been in your sort of literary DNA, or how did you come to write these kinds of stories?
So that's a really great and sort of very personal question in a way, because and the answer is yes and no. When I was a kid, I was, as so many, of that generation that, there was nothing between kids' books and Stephen King. There was no bridging material.
Yeah.
And I was a voracious reader, and by sort of 10, 11, I was reading James Herbert, Stephen King, Dean Koontz, Sean Hudson, all of the kind of that sort of, the sort of deep 80s, I'm being eaten by some kind of animal horror.
Right. And also the sort of blockbusters, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah. Well, no,
Herbert would
they
be
were.
like, oh, rats and nuclear war.
Oh,
Go
yeah.
on.
That actually, I tell you what, that one. Yeah, of
I still
course,
have fond
again,
memories of it.
being a, I was a child of the 80s. So, like when that book came out, I would have been, like 10, 11. And I lived in absolute terror of nuclear war. I think kind of
Oh yeah.
everyone did who had, their childhood sort of through the 70s, 80s, Cold War time. And that was always there, my kind of dream landscape. Like I remember having these kind of horrible dream visions of flying in over the earth, like being in space and seeing the earth and then flying in over it, and it just being this desolate kind of parched wasteland covered in gravestones. This is like kids nightmare kind of thing. So that was always there. And that book in particular was like, why you do this to me, Herbert?
Right. Oh, we'll survive in the sewers.
Yeah.
No, you won't.
Yeah. Exactly. But so yeah, like I kind of grew up on feeding on that stuff, and I loved Stephen King especially. Like I liked all the other stuff, and that was, it was great sex education basically, like, except now I'm convinced that, every time you have sex you then get eaten by a slug or millions of them. Stephen King I always loved,
as far as I know, that's true.
Yeah. Because of the people, the just the kind of depth of, and it's just a bit cheesy and obvious to say like the depth of character, but there it is. He really portrayed, well, and continues to really sort of portray people, and in very kind of broad social portrayals, like, in a Dickens sort of way. There are kind of characters there that are there because he's interested in that. Wants to kind of show you those people, and like that always really appealed to me. But I got a bit sidetracked in my teens in ways that I won't go into in great detail here in public. But
which necessitated you having to flee to Australia.
no, that came later. That came later. But there are autobiographical elements of it in semi-autobiographical in The Measure of Sorrow, the collection. In my 20s, or went to university and studied. I studied film, but did a kind of minor in writing, and the university that I was at, like the kind of writing, the English department, really was kind of built up around these sort of super realist. Oh God, I'm trying to think what's his name. The guy that wrote Kes, whose name completely escapes me now. Do you know the Ken Loach movie Kes?
Oh,
Uh,
okay, okay, okay.
like super depressing film about a boy, like working class boy, Northern England, finds takes care of a kestrel, and it's sort of like the most precious thing
Oh,
in his utterly horrendous
let's
life.
go to IMDb and
Oh
see what they
yeah,
can
yeah.
tell us.
But so the guy that wrote the
IMDb.
book the film is based on was one of the tutors, and
Oh,
he wasn't
okay.
directly my tutor, but it was like that real school of kind of uh kitchen sink realism was what I was kind of learning to write within. And so through my
Right.
20s, like I still had that weird urge. Like, when I was at uni, my obsessions were kind of like Burroughs, Borges, Ballard, the three Bs
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
of the
yeah.
kind of that spectrum um, of weird, I guess. But so I always had that kind of tension between the, wanting to sort of really realistically portray life as it is, life as it is, but then with this streak of that's something completely fucked up that
Right,
is,
right, right. So
and
the writers who were listed are Barry Hines,
Barry
Ken Loach,
Hines, that's it.
and Tony Garnett.
Yeah, so it's Barry Hines.
Okay.
But yeah, like if you want to have the most transcendentally depressing film experience, watch Cares.
Fun for the whole
So,
family.
yeah. Yeah, you'll know what I'm talking about. So yeah, like through my 20s, I kind of had this endless succession of realist novels that I got 3 chapters into, and it's like I'm
Right,
bored now. So I started lots of books
right.
through that time, and then came to Australia and just couldn't write at all. Um, and after burning the book, was like, I'm going to just do something short. I'm going to start little. I'm going to start on things I can finish.
It'll be easier to burn the next
Yeah,
time.
that's it. That's it. Um, and and the first idea that I had was just sort of shameless kind of horror crime thing, and it was so fun. It's just, and it just kind of connected me back to that thing, and I guess
Mhm.
coming back and sort of writing it and having more ideas that fit in that mold has kind of made it possible. Like I get energized by those ideas. They're fun. It's enjoyable to write.
Right.
But then all of that kind of, I guess, that sort of sensibility of aspiring to write realist or realistic stuff, it provides a kind of backbone to it or something. But I still feel because of having been away from it so long, like I wasn't really following horror or weird fiction past that kind of Borges and Burroughs, and they're very in the past. I had no finger on the
Right.
pulse of what was happening, so I still feel like a dilettante. Do you know what I mean? Just because I can't, like I mean, doing things like this, or doing a panel or something, particularly when it's about horror, I just feel like I just don't know what to say about this stuff. Like I know the stuff that I read when I was a kid, and I know the stuff I'm
Right.
reading now, but I don't feel like I'm an authority on it. Um,
That's probably just as well. Like
yeah,
I mean, um, I sometimes think, when you feel like you're an authority on something, that's a dangerous time.
yeah,
Like when you think you know what you're doing.
yeah.
What's because Borges made a huge impression on me. I can
Mm,
remember the elegance of. I mean, I don't read Spanish, so I had to read
yeah,
it in translation. But even so, the elegance of the language and of the conceits. I My undergraduate writing program, I thought I might want to be a creative writing major, but the guy who was in charge of that was stolidly and boringly realist, and And so that just kind of killed any interest I had
Mm.
in doing. I was like, no, I'm not gonna do this. I know kind of what I want to do, and even if at that point I wasn't sure I wanted necessarily to write horror, but I wanted to write stuff that was horror adjacent.
Yeah.
And this guy wanted you to write about your first sexual encounter and how disappointing it was, and as long
Okay.
as you could do that, you were good.
Yeah. And
And
how traumatized you were by your parents' breakup, or your
exactly, it
your
was
middle
very
class
much.
relationship breaking down.
Yeah, it was, and it's funny, the people that I know, I think this has changed in more recent years, but I had friends who did their MFAs and that sort of stuff in the late 90s into the sort of turn of the century, and it seems to me that their creative writing programs were often much more conservative, sort of
Mm,
aesthetically speaking, than the literature programs were. The literature programs
right.
were sort of breaking open and looking at all kinds of new stuff, and the creative writing programs were like, no,
Mm. Well,
this is
it's a bit like art, actually, in the way that it's very much about craft, and it's still life. Like an art
yeah,
program.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah,
here's a bowl of fruit. Draw the bowl of fruit. But I want to
right.
do an installation. Sit the fuck down and draw fruit.
Who do you think you are? Get
Yeah.
back to your fruit.
Yeah,
Those
yeah. So I
pears are
wonder if
going
it's
to
kind of
feed
like
you.
that. A kind of well, but also there is a real um uh what I'm trying to talk about here is that there's this sort of two ways, I guess, of viewing the world through literature, or multiple ways, but one that has a lot of dominance in the sort of literary space is this idea of a kind of record of life as it is lived, um, which which is sort of great, but at the same time, it doesn't really allow for the reality of imagination, and that's something that I think, like in a way, like I really struggle with genre. And when people ask me kind of what I write, I really struggle to know what to say,
Right,
because for me, the thing that has primacy is the imagination, and wherever it goes. And if it's like,
right,
here's a fucked up dark thing, okay, that's where I'm going with that. Or but it's not always. And it's I don't know, without sounding too kind of arch religious, I feel really in service to that. I guess the sort of whims of the imagination. And
right.
when things work for me, it's because I'm not trying to impose too much of my own kind of conscious, that you, the kind of creator, are acting, well, not as creator, but kind of craftsman, realizing something that's coming from a part of you that you don't have so much control over.
Right, right. Well, in a way, right, it goes. It's a look back towards Aristotle, not Aristotle. I'm sorry, Plato,
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
Socrates, and the notion of the
The
poet as
daemon.
the sort of, yeah, the voice of the muse, and this sort of stuff, and um, yeah, I feel like there's a lot to unpack there, because on the one hand, I think that one of the things that distinguishes, like, say, Stephen King and
Mm,
some of the other writers of that generation, Peter Straub in particular, is
yeah.
that King takes what he gets from Lovecraft and from Richard Matheson, and he sort of brings that into conversation with what he gets from Theodore Dreiser and Frank Norris, the American naturalists, and also some of the American crime writers, people like John D. MacDonald, and so you get this really interesting synthesis, and I think that Straub does something similar. It's a lot of Henry James, yes, but also Lovecraft and such,
Mm,
and then that comes into contact with Iris Murdoch and Henry James,
yeah.
and so I think I think that's part of the reason that their work has lasted and continues to resonate, maybe, is because you're seeing that, even though we think, oh, Stephen King, the king of horror, all this kind of
Yeah,
stuff,
yeah.
yes, but he's made, and so that, what and I think actually a lot of writers are doing that right now. I think that
Mm.
I feel like I see it all over the place. You know, the writers who are taking Stephen King in some cases, you know, the whatever is received as traditional horror at this point, and then they're Paul Tremblay's a big Kurt Vonnegut fan, you know,
Yeah,
and so Laird Barron is a big Cormac McCarthy fan, and you know these so these writers are smashing those things together, and that makes really I feel like that makes really
yeah,
interesting work. So that what you're talking about, you know, with sort of a social realist, mimetic naturalism, Salman Rushdie calls it.
right.
Um, but sort of smashing that together
Mm,
with just weird stuff, the Borgesian stuff or Ballard, you know, and I feel like here's the thing, I feel like Ballard was doing that himself, you know,
yeah,
like he was the French surrealists and, you know,
yeah, yeah,
smashing that
yeah,
together with traditional science fiction. Hey, car crashes. So
yeah,
I think that's actually, I think that's part of the reason maybe that this kind of stuff can be really interesting. You know, your book is great and it's very different from my stuff or from Paul's stuff or from Blair's stuff. There were certain family resemblances. You
yeah,
know, I think somebody who was well read enough could look at a lot of our stuff and say, oh yeah, there's Stephen King in the background. I see
yeah,
him over there and these certain moves these writers make. But the the bringing together of I think when I was reading your stuff, I was like, oh, there's a, you know, it's weird because like Ballard and Kafka, you know, that like there were
yeah, yeah.
ways in which they seemed to, but there were, I think it was the opening story, right, about the guys on the trapped on the beach.
Oh, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
that I was like, oh, a beach in Australia, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm never going to a beach in Australia.
I was
Yeah.
like, what is this? What is he trying to do about this? You know, um, but you know, so it felt like there was Kafka in there, and also, and again, I don't know if you've read Kafka or how much of him you've read, and also Aikman, you know, felt
Yeah.
very much like these sort of like spectral presences, if you will, in the work in really interesting and exciting kinds of ways.
Oh, well, thank you, John. Like that means a lot. And Kafka is like I have a very complicated relationship with Kafka, where
Lie down on the couch. We'll
yeah.
talk about it. Okay.
No, I mean I kind of both adore him, and he makes me so angry too. Like like I think the trial is brilliant uh, in a sort of anger-inducing way, which is which is kind of
Which is the point.
that
Yeah.
is the point.
Like a dog. Yeah.
But then like, I just remember reading The Castle after reading the trial and going, wait a minute, did you just do a find and replace? And take this manuscript and replace everything where it says the trial and put the castle instead. It just felt like this kind of the same
Right.
thing that he
Right.
was struggling against. But at the same time, what I love about Kafka, which you get in Ligotti too, and which
Yes.
I really find in sort of inspiring, is that sort of dreamlike enclosure of the world. It has this illusion of reality, but if you kind of get too close to the edges, it just starts to dissipate, and you just realize that you're trapped in a sort of sphere of imagination, if that makes
Yeah. Yeah.
sense. You're trapped in someone else's dream,
Yeah.
and if you look at things out with the corner of your eye, they seem real. But then you kind of start to zoom in close to them. It's like, wait. What's going on
Right.
here?
Right. That is the, yeah.
Um,
That's not what I thought it was.
yeah, and there's a kind of claustrophobia to that, which is I don't know, I kind of find very appealing. Yeah, people particularly in Ligotti, which is just kind of off the hook.
But what's
uh,
fascinating about your stuff, though, I mean, and I don't, all right, just relax, Legati fans, because I'm going to say
yeah.
that, you know, I don't think Legati does character particularly.
No,
I don't think he's interested in
no,
doing
no, no, no. It's
character
not. It's
particularly
not
well.
there. It's just,
Yeah,
it's just not there.
I think oddly, I don't think he does character well, but I think he does voice, a
Mm.
particular range of voice he does very well. But I don't know if I think Kafka does character better than Legati does, maybe, or anyway. But yeah, I know, right? How do you,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, because you don't get a sense of what's weird about Kafka is it. it has this illusion of intense realism,
Yes.
and actually, sort of, if you start to kind of, like I say, you're kind of getting close to it and go, are these all just ciphers? like,
Right, right. Well, what's the
uh,
one with the torture device? Uh, Man, I haven't, and I love the story, so of course I can't. But anyway, there's a Kafka story, and this guy is visiting the penal colony.
oh yeah, 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 yeah,
The guy is visiting a penal colony, and he's going to watch this horrible machine kill this prisoner, and he's not really that interested, and blah blah blah. And you sort of think that maybe it's as you're reading it, it's intense and it's horrifying, and is it, what is it,
mm,
and the from an interpretive standpoint, right, the story just keeps like squirming, because then suddenly at the end there's like this weird kind of like messianic element that suddenly pops up on the screen. You say, what am I reading?
yeah,
What is, what, like, I'm reading something, I'm having an experience, but what is the nature, what is the nature of that experience, but I think what your stuff has, I think you do character much more strongly than Ligotti or Kafka. It's like I think that's important to you in a way that it's not.
No, it really, no,
To
thank you. And that really, no, that really is true. Like, and it's sort of weird. It's something that I struggle with in a way, because it's quite hard to make some weird ideas fit in the real world. And that was actually the problem I had with that title novella, the Measure of Sorrow. There's weird, off the charts weird stuff that happens in that, and in the original. Oh, you're frozen again, John.
I'm back. Yeah, I
Yeah.
froze. I froze, and then I went away.
I thought that you were just like, yeah, I'm done. Yeah. I've had enough.
This is where you should put some of the weird excerpts. Where you're like,
Right,
look,
yeah.
Langan froze up here, so here's a couple of extracts just to keep you
Yeah.
going. So you were
Um,
saying, yeah, you were talking
I
about
don't know. So
character and
yeah, so like in the original version of that, it was um much weird, because actually, so like the original seed of the idea came from a dream. And like that's a lot of the kind of a lot of I get a lot of ideas from dreams. I have very kind of vivid, rich dream life, almost to the extent that every morning I wake up and go, "Oh, the real world." um, and one of the things that I found so hard, like so in the original version, the barn actually kind of changed itself, like this kind of vampiric presence of the barn. Um, the things that it kind of drew from the people, it actually kind of reshaped itself based on that, and that was just too weird an idea to make work. like and to fit into a kind of a real world. But also, actually, I think I have a kind of, there's a contamination element, like where I go, this story is just going to be pure fucking weird, super weird, and then like 12 pages in, I'm like, and I'm so interested in this person and their journey.
right, 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 right.
I haven't even got to the weird bit yet, and then so I think I do get hijacked by my interest in people.
Well, but that's I mean, it's definitely there's definitely that Ligottian trend, the sort of indifferentist
Right? Yeah,
trend
yeah.
in terms of the treatment of character. But then there is that that sort of King trend, which
Mm,
I think probably comes out of Richard Matheson for him and Ray Bradbury and such,
right. Yeah.
and I think you still see that, and that there are definitely writers who are less interested in character,
Mm,
and there were writers who were all about the characters, and I think most of us probably like float somewhere in the
in the
middle.
middle. Yeah, I like. I mean, I do like. I mean, I love Ligotti, and like I say, I have a complex relationship with Kafka. But like, I actually miss the kind of I do still see that as a shortcoming, not having an interest in people. But you'd read the kind of Ligotti's philosophical stuff, and you go, oh, okay, all right,
I
I see
understand
it now.
why. Yeah, understand what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah. um. Yeah. Yeah. Like I couldn't. Like I say, I mean, even if I try to write something that's just kind of pure, weird people creep in there with their sort of mundane concerns, and I think I just can't escape that. But
Well, it's something. I mean, it's an interesting, to step back. I guess it's very much. It seems to me, right? What happens to weird fiction, horror fiction, you know, second half of the 20th century, especially the last quarter of the 20th century, and now into the 21st century, is that it's very much concerned, isn't it, with our response, our individual responses to strange events, strange incursions into our reality. Um, and on the one hand of it, so I was thinking with the measure of sorrow and thinking, well, grief, death. I mean, that's the big incursion.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
the biggest incursion that happens to us. But it's also, there are so many other little incursions that or even just the death of someone else. The death of yourself is the big incursion, I guess, right? But the biggest incursion or excursion. But the death of a loved one, or even just Tina Turner, right? We were talking about
yeah,
that
yeah,
before. Some celebrity who seemed to just be like a star in the firmament or whatever, and suddenly, boom, they're not there, or they're not there in the same way in
yeah,
her
yeah.
case.
Yeah, it's interesting that, like, and particularly with the celebrities thing, and I'll probably get cancelled for saying this. We've been through like 4 or 5 years of kind of non-stop celebrity death. I mean, it's happening all the time, but it just seemed like there was this kind of flurry of, you know, uh,
Yeah, there was a sort of
really
like
important
suddenly it was, yeah, Prince was gone and
Prince,
David Bowie
Bowie.
was
Yeah, yeah.
gone. Yeah, 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 yeah.
That,
Lou
there
Reed.
was this. It
Yeah.
felt like there was this tidal wave of that. Um, but I don't know. Like I just sort of don't grieve for them. And this is going to sound so callous, but I don't grieve for them because I didn't know them. Like the people weren't a presence in my life. It was the work, and
Mhm.
the and the work is
Right.
still there. They're gone. They won't make more work, but the thing that I had the relationship with is still there. It's sort of, it's sad and moving, but I don't get hit really hard by it, I think. I thought you
Oh, there we go.
cancelled
Okay.
me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cancel me
No,
yourself.
no, yeah. I was just like, how dare you?
Yeah, I'm
Well,
out.
I
I'm
think
out. This is
the, I mean, the weird thing I think is, because on some level, yeah, I'm like, all that is all of David Bowie's work remains,
Hmm.
and there's a ton of it. Um, I think in especially in this day and age, right? I mean, it's you can YouTube everyone,
Hmm.
like I went through, I don't even remember why, but a couple of years ago, must have been a COVID related thing, I was just watching these interviews that Salman Rushdie and usually Martin Amis and sometimes Ian McEwan would do. And I just, for some weird reason, I just found listening to those three guys talking and talking about the past and whatever very comforting.
Hmm.
And so when Amos died the other day, I felt it in a slightly more personal way,
Right.
because I was
Yep.
like, I've seen that guy, like
Yeah.
I've
Yep.
so I think that even for, you can understand it, given how film stars, rock stars are on the Graham Norton show or whatever it is, like you can understand how we see at least a projection of them as people,
Hmm.
if you
Yeah.
will. But I think now, even with writers who maybe once upon a time would have remained a little bit more elusive and mysterious, now you can watch, go online, and any writer who's been alive in the last, 50 years, certainly you can find plenty of stuff about them.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
mean, there's stuff about, I'm out there, like that's ridiculous, like um so I think that we and I feel like I wonder, this is like way tangential, but there's been a big interest, certainly in France, but in other places too, in so-called auto fiction, life writing, or, lightly fictionalized, or however you want to put it. And I wonder to what extent those two things relate to one another. I'm not
Mm.
not 100% sure. the writer Jeff Ford has done that a lot in
Yeah, yeah.
his I'd say for about the past 15 years. There are more and more stories about him and Lynn,
Yeah,
or he and
yeah.
his
But
wife
I
are just
but I love that. Like,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
particularly in the kind of context of weird, and sort of weird, creepy fiction.
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, anything where there's involving an element of the supernatural or something that's just not quite right. And going back to the realism thing, you know, one of the reasons for wanting to really kind of ground things in very real, um, in a very real world and with real people, is that you've got to anchor the weirdness to something. Otherwise, it's fantasy. Otherwise
Yeah, yeah.
it's just made up stuff, and it doesn't freak you out if it's not. If you can't see your life or life as it is lived,
Yeah, yeah.
then that kind of disjunct doesn't have any effect. It's just made up stuff.
Right.
And I love Jeff Ford's stories for that, where it's just like, and I was just, having a cup of coffee and writing a story, maybe this one.
Right, 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 right.
And then I stopped off at this place and some freaky shit happened. It's
Right.
like, and, and you completely believe it, because it's
Yeah.
like the real life is the frame story to, it's the thing that
Yeah.
kind of sets you, it creates the suspension of disbelief, I guess. Yeah.
Well, what's funny is that from a kind of craft standpoint, Ford's use of that device allows him, and I think he said once that he got it from, among other sources, Isaac Bashevis Singer,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
um, where people would just come to, in a lot of, or in a number of Singer's stories, they knock on the door and he's like, hey, and they're like, are you Singer, the writer? And he's like, yeah. And they're like, I got a story for you. And they sit down and they tell him the
Yeah,
story and then they leave. And so I think one of the advantages that gives to Ford is he doesn't have to explain a whole lot, because it's like, look,
exactly,
I just
exactly.
this weird story,
Yeah.
and what he has to, although you're right that like it means in a way that whoever is telling that story to him has to be very realistic, or more realistic, so
Mm.
that you buy this. Oh, this is the story this weird guy told me,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, okay, um,
I think
yeah,
the ultimate of that, that autobiographical incursion kind of thing is the Dice Man. Where it's, have you read Dice Man?
I have. I don't think I have.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, this is a non-starter.
No,
but,
no, no.
but
I'm
where
curious
it's,
to hear about it.
where it's, I mean, do you know broadly what it's about? Okay, so it's like, I think maybe in the
No,
70s there was
no.
this big
I'm
sort of,
ignorant.
uh the reason I bring it up, yeah, so it's about this kind of psychologist who decides to kind of live his life by the rolls of the dice,
Oh, okay.
and he will completely do exactly what the dice says. He sets the parameters around what 1 to 6 means, but he takes away the kind of, freedom of choice, and it just quickly spirals into outrageously first amoral and then immoral and then criminal behavior.
Very
Um,
nice.
but the protagonist and the author have the same name, and so you're all the way through going,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
what? And it's never explained. Is this a work of fiction? Is it an autobiography? Never. Maybe there's interviews out there somewhere where he says, but
Right, right, right.
in terms of the holding the book in your hands, you don't know. I have that feeling too about Carlos Castaneda. Have you read it,
Uh,
much or any of his stuff?
I have not, and it's funny. He came up recently in another context,
Oh,
so
okay.
it probably is the universe's way of telling me to check him out.
Oh yeah. So we're going off on a massive tangent here, but he's
That's fine. The people are happy with tangents.
yeah.
They want to see who shows up in the door behind you.
Yeah. Anthropologist who goes to study, sort of yaki Indian medicine man,
Right,
Don
right,
Juan. And it's the first book is kind of weird anthropology,
right,
he's trying to be quite serious, and then Don Juan gets him to take all kinds of crazy drugs, and he basically writes down his experience. But then the books
right,
that follow just go
right,
completely off
right,
the charts, and it's like, dude, is this what is going on here? Are you just
right,
making this shit up? What? It's all couched as his anthropological records of his experiences becoming
right.
magic person, essentially, under Don Juan's
Right.
guidance. But it just goes so off there that you're like, I don't know how to read this. Do I read this as a real thing or as a awesome piece of fiction? Like it sits in this wonderful liminal space between the two.
Well, it's hard to know in that case too. I guess the question that you wind up asking is like, okay, it may be fictional or it may be the creation of his hallucinations or whatever, but is in almost what is the spirit in which it's offered? You know, is it offered as a hoax? Like I'm just going to make some bucks off this, or is it a wonderful work of invention, or is it I had these hallucinations, but there's some kind of truth to them or some kind of truth value to them, you know? And yeah, I don't know what the answer is, obviously.
Well, but that sort of raises an interesting question, though, and you know, to me, this sort of gets a bit to the heart of the appeal of the weird, is if those questions are unanswered, what are you left with? You know, like how,
right.
if you're not told, if you're not given a context of how to experience this, all ways of experiencing it are possible.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
in a way, like not being given the context is sort of part of the experience. Like
Right.
that questioning and going, I do not know how to relate to this. I mean, you know, like Jeff's stories, like what?
Right.
It's actually
Salamander
happened to
people.
you? Like,
No, I know every now and again I'm like, did this like, and I'm like, this can't have happened, right?
yeah,
Right? You know, it no, what's interesting too, right, is that, you know, the where I think that, you know, the fantastic, broadly speaking, I think that the where it has its uses in terms of thinking in a quasi-realist setting, whatever that means, is that our experience, our internal experience, I think, doesn't always, maybe even often, match up to a realist story.
yeah,
And it's you know the you know, because even in something that I think of like a, you know, a Hemingway story where he's trying to be as realistic as possible by cutting as much out, he actually cuts so much out that it becomes kind of stylized and it no
well,
longer seems, you know,
exactly. You get back to that kind of
purely.
Kafka Ligotti thing of you're seeing a world that's been sort of sculpted to,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah,
there's
the
nothing beyond it.
style, yeah, the style has sculpted it, and I
Yeah,
think that so that the weird element, the horror element in a story or what have you, um in some, and I don't want to just reduce it to it's a symbol for the character's emotions,
mm,
but it might be a manifestation of their experience, that like their almost their existential experience of reality. So
yeah,
you know, this I feel like this allows us to come back to the notion of sorrow, the measure of sorrow, you know, that there are these stories in which the characters are in these situations, you know, different situations in each story, but which allow are manifestations in some way of their internal states, even
mm,
possibly of their unconscious states,
yeah,
possibly of things that they're not fully aware of. And that, you know, that barn is such a fantastic, I feel like it's such a fantastic symbol, you know, because it's made from the trees that the first colonizers cut
yeah,
down. So it's the, you know, it just does so many different things, and just by being itself, let alone anything else. And certainly anything, what is it Flaubert said, anything can become interesting if you stare at it long enough. I think it was Flaubert anyway.
yeah.
I once we one house my wife and I lived in with this big picture window, and I wanted to write that on top of the window. Just it looked out over a road. But um, so
Yeah.
what is next? I mean, you granted you just were celebrating the release of this book, but what's coming next? Are you going to is there going to be another giant novel, or you know?
Well, I finished a book last year, which is, you know, it's out on submission. See what happens with that. That's
Very
very
good.
different to, very different in the sense that it's completely not weird. Um, Oh, actually, it probably is quite weird. When I wrote it,
We'll
I thought,
we'll be the judge of what's
yeah,
weird.
I,
You
I
just
I remember just writing it and going, "This is me writing my mainstream book,"
right,
and then giving it to people, and they're like, "No,
right.
this is not mainstream." But it's more. It's there's no supernatural elements in it. It's about an 11-year-old sociopath sort of
Nice.
coming into her power.
I'm tempted to say so an 11-year-old.
Well, yeah. But yeah, so it's more a sort of suburban suspense thing. But like I say, that was what was in my head. I was reading a lot of Patricia Highsmith at the time of writing it, so it's very kind of infused with that. But it's basically, yeah, a 11-year-old girl really making life a hell for everyone around her. It was enormous fun to write. We'll see what happens
Oh,
with
I'm
that.
sure. Yeah, yeah.
I've got I'm buoyed up on the fact of actually having finished a novel. I was like, right, straight into the next one. and I thought that finishing one would mean that the next one would be really easy. It turns out it just takes me a really long time to write anything. So I'm plodding away, getting sick of, and then coming back to, and getting sick of, and coming back to.
Well, it's
A
the thing, isn't it? You learn how to write the novel you're writing.
Yeah,
And then the next novel is a different there has to be some carryover, I feel, but unless you're just writing by formula,
the carryover is
most
in craft, I think.
yeah.
But I mean, going back to what we were talking about before, some things just take a lot of effort to drag up into the beach,
Yeah.
and they may come up in bits, and then it's so heavy it sort of slips out of your hands and goes back under again. But
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm doing a bit of a dance with a sort of suburban cosmic horror novel,
Very
which is
nice.
sort of inspired by John Wyndham, who I just love all of his stuff. So taking
Yeah, the
the kind of English sort of country vibe to suburban Australia.
very nice.
Yeah,
Very
so we'll
nice.
see how that
It
goes. And then trying to every time I get sick of that, it's like I better write a short story to cheer me up
right.
and to
So
prove that I can finish something.
so what in terms of your own reading, what
Hmm.
after everybody buys The Measure of Sorrow
Oh yeah.
and is like, okay, we have to wait a little while for the next novel. What are some things that you would recommend? What is stuff that you'd like to give a leg up to?
Okay, so this is gonna kind of make you wince, but I've just been reading Corpse Mouth and other autobiographies, and love it. I love it, and I'm
Thank
just
you.
going to give a
Thank
big
you.
up for that. It is really excellent. Everyone should buy it if they haven't already.
Thank you.
Um,
My bank account thanks you.
yeah, I've been reading a lot of Peter Straub. Actually, I ventured into his stuff when I was, through the Talisman. Actually, through King, through the
Yeah.
Talisman. I picked up Coco as a kid. I was like,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, King, you can read as an 11-year-old, and it all makes sense.
Yeah.
Straub is actually just operating on a level that I think you do need. You do need kind of adult experience to connect with. Coco just absolutely destroyed me, and
That's an
reading
astonishing.
all of that,
Yeah.
the Blue Rose trilogy.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so just kind of just loving his compassion, actually, particularly in Coco.
Which is it is a remarkable climax.
Yeah,
I still am not sure I've read another novel with a climax like that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. It,
and I don't. It's like I want to talk about it more, but I
no, same.
don't
You don't want to
because
ruin
I
it.
want.
Yeah,
I want. But at some
people to come
point
to it
when
themselves.
yeah, it's just what he does there is so is so amazing that it's. I don't know if it's his best book, like I love Ghost
Mm.
Story. Ghost Story is just I read that first and I was probably about 14 or 15 and I remember thinking when I finished it, I don't like, I didn't get all of this, but that was
Mm.
cool. That was actually
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
like, it was actually kind of exciting, but and I still feel that way,
yeah.
A couple of summers ago, I reread The Hellfire Club and Mr. X, and got so this is second time through, I was like, holy shit, these are amazing books.
Yeah,
I did not appreciate how great these books were the first time through,
yeah.
because there's so much there.
And they're books that you can kind of come back to, and they're different for the different time
Yeah,
in your life. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely,
But
absolutely.
I've been, so just to do some more plugs for people.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I've been
yeah.
reading a lot of I mean, a lot of other people's collections at the moment, and Kathy Koja's Velocities, which came out a couple of years ago from Meerkat Press, is just,
Yeah,
jaw-droppingly brilliant.
yeah.
Kirsten McDermott, who's an Australian author, her collection Hard Places that came out last year is also excellent. Karen's um, Bitters, so she's got
Hmm.
Cemetery Dance. She's got a novella out.
I feel like I have that around here somewhere. I just,
Uh,
because I thought I should have it out so I can plug Karen in case
oh
things go
yeah,
badly. Yeah.
that is
Oh,
off the
there it is.
charts weird. Oh
There it
yeah, there you
is.
go.
Off the chain. Yeah.
Yeah, no, seriously. Like it's the sort of thing that you want to just like review just with swear words and
I've
or
never
sort
heard
of.
it put that way, but yes,
Oh
that's a
no,
good way to.
we were all out to dinner a while ago. So Isabel Carmody, the Australian author, was doing an art show. We all went out to dinner with her afterwards, and Karen Bitters was just about to come out, and Karen was explaining to Isabel what it was about, and Isabel just sort of went, like, had this kind of look of palpable disgust, and it's like, there it is,
Right.
there's your photo blurb, like no words, just just a
Right.
picture of Isabel's face here.
She's
So
yeah, she's
yeah,
her imagination, Karen's imagination is just it actually, in a weird way, it reminds me of Ford, although they're
oh
very
yeah, yeah,
different
yeah,
writers. But there's that same sense of like, you're going to get something, which is elements that you recognize, but from just such a different perspective. That
mhm.
there's just such a unique authorial voice there, an authorial perspective there, that
Yeah.
is just marvelous.
Well, this is actually something, so at risk of just dragging this conversation on infinitely, like something that I've been really thinking about a lot, and particularly in the context of having my own collection, but reading other people's collections, and collections as opposed to novels. There's something so personal about a collection in a way that a novel doesn't have to be.
Yes.
You get so much more of a sense of like a whole person in a way. You kind of see
Yeah.
the author through the all the different kind of scenarios. There's a sort of breadth of understanding of them, and and a really great collection. And this is my sort of thing that I'm kind of coming to and really struggling to really articulate. But what makes a really amazing collection is how much it is sort of representative of that person, not in an autobiographical way, but them as a of
Oh no,
their of the
I
flavor of
think
their imagination.
that's a lovely phrase. Yeah, yeah. I think um there's a German philosopher, Gadamer, I think, who talks about that, the way that, like, in a work of art, the artist kind of like meets themselves or something like that,
Mm,
and I think that it's like what we were talking about before. Martin Amis is physically gone, but his words remain. Tina Turner is physically
yeah,
gone, but her songs remain. And there's some way in which, in art, at its best anyway, there is this, um I feel like Orwell talks about this too. He's got like I feel like it's an essay on Dickens where he talks about that, the way that when you're reading a novel, say, you're kind of imagining the person that wrote the
mm,
novel, like
yeah,
who that is, and so often, same thing with any kind of art, I guess. So often, like, we're so disappointed when we find out that who the person is, but
yeah. They're
because
so
there's
much
like
smaller.
this. Yeah, but there's this, but there's also a way in which I'm like, but they are, but they aren't.
Mm,
Like there's still, like that person that's created by those words, if you will, like, kind of still exists.
yeah,
The
yeah,
the the person behind the measure of sorrow is still there,
Yeah.
regardless of whatever happened in your teens. You know,
Yeah.
like that's, you know,
You have I think you have a sort of TARDIS-like view, right? Like from the outside, any author is just a police box, you know.
yeah,
But when
yeah,
you
yeah,
actually
just this
go
little
into
thing.
the stories, you're kind of opening up into the vastness of, it's essentially an illimitable world. It's
Yeah,
limited only by how much they have the time to kind of put
yeah,
on
I
paper
think
and shit.
so. Yeah, yeah, no, I think so. I think there is, yeah, and the and it's a weird, the physics are very weird, you know,
Mhm.
it doesn't, you know, you can have a writer like Raymond Carver or Catherine Mansfield, who's you know, a miniaturist in some ways, and yet whose miniatures are worlds, you know,
Yeah,
within themselves. That wasn't a freeze. That was just me hitting
yeah,
the
yeah.
computer, you know. Um, but yeah, it's so where, if people who have suffered through this conversation to this point want more, where can they
Yeah.
find you on social media?
Oh, okay. So on social media, well, I'm on Facebook under my full name, Joseph Ashley Smith. I'm
Not
on,
Joe. People don't say
yeah,
Joe.
don't
You get
say
very
Joe.
upset.
Or,
You,
or
you're like,
Langan
hey
never gets
Joe.
out of the cellar.
Right. Hey Joe, where are you going with that gun in your hand? To
Yeah,
deal with Langan.
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm on Twitter for whoever knows how much longer.
We've all
Cursorily
been
on
saying
Twitter.
that. We've all been saying that,
I
but we're not
know,
leaving. You know,
but
we're all
I'm
like,
not.
I'm out of there.
But I'm not committed to it either. I'm
Right.
reluctant to leave, but I'm not giving of myself there. But I'm at Spook Tapes, and my website is www.spooktapes.net. But all of this will be kind of shown, and that is being shown, people watching it now, in the context of a kind of pseudo live event. So you can connect with me and hopefully with John too.
No, I
The
hate
Q&A
people.
thing after.
Yeah, no, no.
No, okay.
I
Well, I'll have a kind of cardboard cutout of John that I'll wiggle
right
around.
there, like a drawing of me. You know? You'll say to your kids, "Draw
And,
this guy." They'll be like, "Who
yeah.
is this guy?"
What do you
Don't
think of
worry
that,
about
John? Wow.
it. You'll just use the outtakes. You'll
Yeah.
just be like, I'll just be saying like stupid non
Yeah.
sequiturs. You know.
Yeah, it'll be like, so yeah. So John, about your new book. Well, Tina Turner.
Right. What is he having a stroke? Is he all right?
Yeah. He just can't stop talking about Beyond the Thunderdome and what's going on.
And also, you're also, I mean, you and Karen and Aaron do Let the Cat In,
Let the cat in, of course. Yeah.
which is a wonderful podcast, and which gives it's I feel that I've come to feel that the best podcasts, that there is this feeling like, oh, I'm hanging out with my friends again, you
Yeah.
know, regardless of what they're talking about, you know,
That's
and
when it is the thing that kind of we always promised that we would only do it as long as it was fun, and as long as it remained fun, and that's never been put to the test.
right,
Because every time you just connect with people, and it's like this, it's
fun and lucrative too. I've
yeah.
seen you guys with the big chains, the gold chains, and
Oh
that
yeah,
sort of
yeah,
stuff.
that's it. Yeah,
You
the
know,
bling that
the
doing
bling,
a
right?
kind of
Karen wears that
lo-fi
clock.
podcast
Yeah,
allows is really just
yeah. Actually, she wears, it's a cuckoo clock she wears, which is a
yeah.
little weird, but I mean,
Yeah.
if anyone can pull it off, it's Karen Warren.
Yeah, which brings us back to Aikman, but we have to kind of let that thought
Let
die
that
there.
go.
Yeah.
Let that go there, people.
So, well, John, thank you so much. Like, it's just been fantastic to hang out and talk.
It's been my great pleasure. It's there's so many things about technology, or the way it's used, to make me just hate it.
Mm,
But the thought that we can talk to each other on the opposite side of the globe, that's fantastic.
yeah, it
That's,
is amazing, isn't it? And thank you, everyone, for coming and joining us. And hope that we, or I, or some kind of cardboard flavored slice of John Langan will be joining you in a few moments to answer any questions you might have.
just about well, actually, you know what, about anything. You name it. We'll take a stab at answering.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.